Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are joining from. My name is Sandra Delalikeme, and I am very excited to welcome you to this side event, which is titled Going Beyond Traditional Financing Instruments to Address Today's Disaster Risks in Fragile and Vulnerable Countries. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this event. His name is Joseph Ntifo. He is a senior climate information and early warning system specialist with the Green Climate Fund. He manages over $1 billion portfolio of GCF adaptation projects and has over 20 years of experience in supporting developing countries to implement climate change and development projects in over 100 developing countries globally. Joseph, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Excellencies, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you warm regards from the Green Climate Fund. It's a pleasure to be with you as an African and somebody who has passion for Africa. I'm very hopeful that during this discussion, we'll be able to outline some of the key challenges that Africa is facing in terms of managing disaster risks and creating pathways for attainment of the Agenda 2063, which is critical for Africa to be able to transform into the Africa we want. By way of background, I will like to begin by introducing the keynote remarks. Our distinguished invited ASG from the ACP Secretariat could not attend, so has recommended her representative, Dr. Natalie Kodas, who will give us the opening remarks. So I would like to hand over to Dr. Natalie Kodas to give us a brief introduction of herself and then give us the opening remarks. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have been requested to deliver our Assistant Secretary General Pratt's speech. So without much further ado, I will just cut to the chase. Distinguished representatives, all 79 member states of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the OACPS, which include 47 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, are vulnerable countries. They are either LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, and composites of these. Many are located in the most hazard-prone regions of the world.
25 minutes, huh?
I'm sorry, I'm hearing some background noise, thank you. Yeah, so many are located in the most hazard-prone regions of the world, and 9 countries of the OACPS are among the 15 countries with the highest disaster risk, according to the 2021 World Risk Report. According to a recent 29 OECD report, global climate finance decreased in general, and in case of the 38 OACPS SIDS, it decreased by 25%. This is, of course, great concern when vulnerabilities are increasing and outcomes more complex for all developing countries, and especially SIDS. For the members of the OACPS with middle or high income status, access to climate finance is already challenging, and ODA is no longer available to them. It is worth emphasizing that international action and traditional and new sources of financial and other assistance to all fragile and vulnerable states in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific regions is indeed a moral responsibility. Because while OACPS developing countries are at the front line and face the brunt of the climate change crisis, they have contributed the least and have been compromised the most. These countries also need to contend with natural and exogenous hazard risks, such as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The high cost of international debt servicing for many of our countries further limits and places undue pressures on abilities to adequately respond to disaster risk events and to focus on building resilience. Therefore, urgent acceptance of the increasing dimensions and facets of OACPS's vulnerabilities is required. Our heads of state and government at the 9th Summit in Nairobi, Kenya, in December 2019 also called for this. While the uptake has been slow, we see constructive and positive responses, such as the recent initiative of the establishment of a Resilient Sustainable Trust, the RST by the IMF, that will allow wealthy countries to channel some of their special drawing rights to more vulnerable countries, including vulnerable middle-income countries gravely hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. We would offer that similar initiatives need to be considered for those being gravely hit by the climate crisis and by disaster risks more broadly, particularly because these funds are to be delivered on terms which are in the form of grants. The 180 million euro Intra-ACP EU Disaster Risk Reduction Program under the 10th EDF, where 100 million euros was allocated to Sub-Saharan Africa DRR programs, and an additional 20 million euros was used as seed funding to enhance the capacity of climate centers under the Climate for Development in Africa initiative, CLIMDEV. We are very proud of these, and they have taken us some ways to addressing issues and initiatives, but DRM is needed. Focus needs to continue. This investment was primarily led in Sub-Saharan Africa by the GFDRR, and it was implemented in partnership with the African Union, ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD, and the African Development Bank. And under the 10th EDF program, this will end in December 2021. Efforts under this initiative have enabled our countries to focus on DRR measures through mainstreaming disaster risk management considerations into development policy, planning, and practice decisions. However, the need to inculcate a risk management culture throughout consistent actions and approaches will be necessary going forward. The soon to commence 100 million 11th EDF program will need to focus on preparedness as well as recovery. Such initiatives must, at a practical level, not only differentiate the provenance of risks, but rather ensure that all risk management considerations are integrated into finance and economic planning. As well, catastrophic risk insurance instruments remain important, such as ARC, CCRIF, and PCRIC that operate in the ACPS regions. I want to inform that the Secretariat is now in the final stages of its application to become a delivery partner of the GCF. A positive outcome will realize a new strategic partnership with the GCF and will complement current regional and national implementing entities initiatives and also boost our ongoing partnerships with African Union, European Union, and our regional institutions, the GFDRR, CRUISE, and the relevant UN agencies. The emergence of a new risk financing instrument is needed, and it will ensure collaboration and commitment towards understanding of OACPS vulnerabilities, and it will allow a removal of all obstacles to gain enhanced access to climate finance and to disaster risk financing, so to enable our vulnerable countries in the ACP regions to have a chance to build and strengthen their resilience to all risks that they are becoming increasingly confronted with. I thank you.
Much, Dr. Natalie Kodas. We will proceed with a panel discussion, but to begin with that, I would like to give a brief perspective on the challenges that we are facing in terms of how climate variability and change is becoming one of the major challenges in attaining the Agenda 2063 and other development agenda. Climate is impacting on countries in ways that is so complicated in terms of complex, in terms of risks and its impact. We have seen that the increasing climate variability on the continent of Africa is impacting food systems, health, transport, and a range of other areas of the development agenda. But more importantly, if we look at what happened about a year ago in East Africa, the incidence of low cost coupled with climate variability and change and COVID presented a very significant challenge for most countries across Africa. More importantly, the impact of COVID has exposed our early warning, early action system, for instance, heavily impacting on weather observation and forecast, as well as atmospheric and climate monitoring system. Lack of observation impacts almost every aspect of our ability to predict and respond to climate risk. So we observed that during the period of the COVID, aircraft observation declined by 80%. Availability of surface data also decreased significantly, particularly in Africa. And ocean measurements, which are critical for managing predicting the tropical cyclones and others, as is impacted in the Indian Ocean states, also decreased by 80%. So the transition to a paradigm shifting pathway is very important if Africa will be able to manage impending disasters. It calls for transformational planning and programming, catalyzing climate action, mobilizing investment at scale, and expansion and replication of knowledge. In the recent years, Africa risk reduction agenda has received significant boost in terms of investment as a landmark program building disaster resilience to natural hazard in Sub-Saharan African regions, countries, and communities, which was financed by the European Union and Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific State, OACPS, under the 10th EDF program. And so to discuss these issues in terms of the specific objectives of this discussion, we will be looking at the multi-risk financing strategies at regional, national, and local level. We'll also look at the financing capacity of countries before, during, and after a disaster, and then mitigating the social, economic, physical, and financial impact of disasters in Africa. And finally, we'll look at the financing cascading disaster risks, including recovery from COVID-19. So the structure of this will be to discuss this with distinguished panels who will address two main questions. The first question will be, what is your organization doing around creating the enabling data environment for new innovative risk financing to be considered in an integrated and comprehensive disaster risk management approach? Each of the panelists will have 3 minutes. We'll have 5 panelists making up 13 minutes for the first question. And then we will have also a second question, which is, what best practices can you cite from your organization in mitigating social, economic, financial, and physical risk? To do justice to this 5 distinguished panelists, first among them is Barry Maher, who is a senior financial sector specialist of GFDR GFDR of the World Bank. The second will be Eric Hoare, program manager with EU delegation to the African Union. And then we will also have Francois Kaitakri, who is the Director of Research and Development at Africa Risk Capacity. We will also have Robert Chiano Lomorelo, who is a UNDR specialist, and then James Kinyangi, the coordinator of the ClaimDev Africa Special Fund. So without wasting much time, I would like to introduce the panelists one by one. They will give a brief introduction of themselves, what they do, 30 minutes, and then they will address the question. So let me first call Barry Maher to give us his perspective in terms of what is his organization doing around creating an enabling data environment for new and innovative risk financing to be considered in an integrated disaster risk management. Over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Robert. Greatly appreciate it. Just checking, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay. So yeah, thanks, Robert. So yeah, I mean, I work for the World Bank. I've been working on risk financing in the Africa region for about a decade now. I think, you know, when I think of data in terms of risk financing, what really comes to my mind is it is the foundation or the foundation stone for any risk financing strategy. So no matter what instruments or risk financing instrument you have, be that ag insurance, shock responsive safety net, sovereign insurance, which I'm sure we'll hear from Mark about, or contingency funds, you need to make a decision, you know, when am I going to disperse this instrument? When am I going to use the resources which are available in this instrument and try and deliver them, you know, to affected kind of people, households, businesses in need. And the only way you can make that decision is based on data. So data is absolutely fundamental when it comes to developing good risk financing strategies. I think, at the same time, I just want to kind of flag or highlight that not all data is created equally. There's a vast kind of array of data which stretches from qualitative information gained from interviews with community members all the way to satellite imagery, which is available kind of 24/7, 365 days a year. There's a huge array of data, and all data, in my opinion, has value. It just really depends on to what use you're putting it. And then I think then when thinking about data and risk financing instruments, depending on the risk financing instrument you're looking to establish, that will kind of directly drive your data need requirements. So a very kind of obvious example of this is insurance. So I've worked on multiple agriculture insurance programs across the Africa region, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, South Africa, and also sovereign insurance, which I think we'll hear more from Mark, so I won't really go into that. But particularly with agriculture insurance, and if you're targeting small and medium scale farmers, the traditional products don't work for that market segment. The farms are too small, so you always end up using some sort of yield-based insurance. But because there's an insurance company which is taking on this risk, they're very interested and they're very focused on the data upon which claims will be made. And there's a very obvious reason for that. They want to ensure they're not being cheated. So insurance companies often really focus on the data which is used for agriculture insurance. And that can kind of vary from yield index insurance all the way to kind of weather index or satellite-based insurance. So I'm hearing some background noise. Perhaps someone could mute. Thanks. So when it comes to insurance, as an example, the data quality requirements are very high. So you need to have high quality data. However, if you're looking at something like a contingency fund or a reserve fund, which is held by the Ministry of Finance, there you can have I suppose, looser data needs, data requirements. And perhaps to give an example, I have 30 seconds left. The World Bank, we have an instrument, it's called a development policy operation with a catastrophe deferred drawdown, which is in effect, it's like a contingent line of credit for government, a bit like a credit card for a government with very low interest rates. But the government can only access that money, can only draw down from this credit card if there is a declaration of a state of national emergency. So that's kind of a much softer data kind of requirement which is needed in order to access that instrument. So I just kind of gave two examples there, one being insurance with very high quality data needs. And the World Bank does a lot of kind of projects invest in the Africa region, investing in high quality agricultural yield data, for example. Then a second example is something like the contingent line of credit from the World Bank, which again is like a credit card with low interest rates. But that has kind of much softer data needs. And I'll stop there, Joseph, I've gone over time.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent intervention, very, very clear in terms of what the World Bank is doing. I would like to now hand over to Eric Hua, the Program Manager, EU Delegation to the African Union, to respond to the question. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Joseph. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm Eric Hua. I'm a Program Manager at the EU Delegation to the African Union, and I'm in charge of the portfolio on energy, environment, and climate change, which includes disaster risk reduction. So of course here, from my angle, the idea is really to really showcase how disaster risk reduction and climate change are interlinked. And to respond to the question of the panel, the idea is to showcase a bit more like how data can support decision-making, especially in terms of risk financing and more integrated approach. So in that regard, the European Union is very much supporting a number of activities focusing on climate services, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. And I think in our opening remarks, Dr. Natalie Cordas briefly mentioned the program on building disaster resilience to natural hazards in Sub-Saharan African regions, countries and communities that the EU co-funded from 2013 to 2020. And I think here the idea was really to showcase a bit of the outcomes of this program. So with a total portfolio of more than 150 projects and support to more than 70 countries, there were a lot of targets and milestones that were reached. The program has built capacity of more than 6 ACP regional institutions to have functioning DRR capacity, as well as around 40 ACP countries have successfully integrated DRR and climate change adaptation into their national planning processes, and more than 40 countries have developed risk reduction tools to guide vulnerability reduction. In total, more than 20 countries have undertaken post-disaster needs assessment and recovery planning exercise, and 20 countries have developed national capacities for PDNAs. So around all of these activities, of course, there's a strong need to also develop and implement more disaster risk finance strategies, and there's a need that the European Commission is willing to investigate more about, to possibly moving from upstream approaches to more downstream approaches. And I think the idea is that the global disaster risk finance landscape is quite evolving, and it's really an exciting moment now to continue the work and really make progress in that area. So as of 2022, actually new activities will be funded by the European Commission to further support early warning mechanism at all levels in cooperation with the African Union Commission and the African Risk Capacity. So of course, targeting areas of disaster risk governance and finance. But maybe in this introduction as well, in this first round of question, I would like also to stress that an effective response to climate change, including disaster risk management, needs to be based on the best available scientific knowledge on this. And in that context, I would like to highlight the availability of worldwide Earth observation through the European Copernicus program and the work that we're doing together with the African Union on the global monitoring for environment and security in Africa, so called GMS in Africa, which is an initiative that really aims at supporting African organizations, policymakers and practitioners to make more effective use of Earth observation data to support sustainable management of natural resources, reduce disaster risk, and tackle climate change. And I think through that availability of Earth observation data, there's also a pool of product and services that will be enabled to really make progress and address resiliency on the African continent. Thanks. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the wonderful intervention. You've spoken about the fact that we need data to support decision-making. Climate services is key, and also building natural resilience to disasters. Projects, over 100 projects that is being implemented by the European Union, capacity building in 20 countries, and effective approach should be based on knowledge. And you talk about GMS in Africa as one of the key elements of this. So data capacity building is critical for strengthening and building capacity to manage disaster risks. So thank you very much, Eric. I will now call on Francis Kayi-Takiri, Director of Research and Development, Africa Risk Capacity, to address the first question. Over to you, Francois.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph, and good afternoon to participants. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the African risk capacity, because maybe some of the participants are not aware of the existence of this organization. The African risk capacity is a specialized agency of the African Union, founded in 2012, and the goal is to provide to African countries with a mechanism to access immediate funds to respond to disasters. Our first operations were targeting the drought risk, where the African risk capacity is providing an insurance mechanism so that the countries can actually subscribe to insurance policy, and when there is disaster, there is a payout that will help for emergency response. So far, African risk capacity has 35 member states across country who have signed the treaty, and we have operations in almost 17 countries, and they have been around 70 million payouts since the operations. It's not a big amount of money, but it's still useful to show that in a very the agency is growing. In terms of data and what we're doing to help countries to get data to manage the risk. I would say that the African risk capacity on the side of implementation and operations. We use all those data, for instance, what Eric mentioned about satellite data, actually to build models that are underpinning the insurance policies. The African risk capacity has developed a suite of software and models to address the drought risk, agricultural drought risk, and also range-bound drought risk, targeting pastoral areas. We have developed also a model for the tropical cyclone risk, and we are developing also a model for the flood risk. When the models and the products are developed, we have also the data that we try to use the best available scientific evidence. Those models are made available to the countries, and we do also training to countries, so that when the countries subscribing to the insurance policy, they understand very well the risk that they are taking and the risk they are transferring to the international market. So the innovation of African risk capacity is this possibility to transfer the sovereign risk to the market. This is an innovative way of financing the response to disaster risk, to the climate risk. However, we have identified that this is not sufficient. We need also to help countries to reduce the risk by investing in adaptation programs. That's why also we're planning to develop another product that will help countries invest in adaptation programs so that they can reduce the risk and ultimately reduce the cost of insurance. This is a program that is going to be funded by EU on the 11th EDF program that Eric mentioned, starting from 2022. In terms of data, as I would say that there is a lot of data available around there. Now the challenge actually is to make sense of this data and to have the capacity to analyze them, to interpret them. I myself, my background is in remote sensing, using satellite imagery, and I know that there is a wealth of data which is not really very well used. That's where I think we need also to invest in training people, developing capacity to.
So I think we were. Yeah, like you to summarize, and then we'll move to the next speaker.
Sorry for going over my time. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Francois. I think it's very clear in terms of the uniqueness of the Africa Risk Capacity, specialized agency of the African Union targeting drought risk as an initial entry into the risk insurance space. Support emergency response. 35 countries have signed the treaty, operational in 17 countries. And the innovation that ACT is using is to transfer risk to the international market, but that is not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. The need to really adopt disaster risk reduction through adaptation and mitigation actions are critical. And I'm glad to see that the GCF funded one project through IFA that Africa Risk Capacity is part of it, a part of the Great Green Wall program, and I happen to be the tax manager for that project. Very, very interesting, innovative approach. And we will come back to the details of some of these examples in the next question. And without wasting my time, let me go to Roberto Sciano Lomo Realo, UNDR Associate Expert, to give us his perspective on the first question. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Joseph, and good afternoon, everybody. I am very interesting intervention on from my previous panelist colleagues, and I would it's very good that my intervention will link pretty much on what has been said already. First of all, let me just quickly introduce myself. I work for the Regional Office for Africa of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And over the last 3 years, I've been mainly focusing on the area that we define as DRR economics. I want to just reiterate that as it has been said already by our colleague in the key opening intervention. I mean, official development assistance, is lacking in many developing countries, in particular in Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, for example, when we talk about target F of the Sendai framework, we have designed this target to boost international cooperation, meaning international cooperation for disaster risk reduction. And when we look at figures for Sub-Saharan African countries, we see that most of the resources are actually going to response operations. In particular, when we're looking at humanitarian financing, 1.9 billion were dedicated over the last 10 years on disaster risk reduction, whereas 46 billion were actually dedicated for response operation. This is not better when we're looking at domestic resources. And in our office, through the 1011 EDF, which UNDRR has been a partner together with the other partners that were mentioned before, we have done several studies to understand how much countries are spending in disaster risk reduction. And this is on average over 17 countries that we have looked at. It's about 1% of government spending. And this 1% actually decomposes into even less when we're talking about prevention and mitigation operations, because most of the resources also at the national level are dedicated to response operations. Again, through the 10th ADF, we have been building in relation to data, we've been building the evidence base to inform on how much countries are investing, how much the development partners are spending in disaster risk reduction. And these are all information that we have been using to inform the development of national disaster risk reduction strategies, and also associated action plans that where we need to understand which are the resources available, where those resources need to go, and then obviously which kind of risk financing instruments those countries could be using. We have been also working towards improving the understanding of historical disaster impacts. As you might know, in relation to the Sendai framework, we have developed the Sendai framework monitoring tool, which is together with this Inventar database, is trying to capture all the impacts of disasters over time. Impacts that we have disaggregated by assets, but also by the type of hazards, and also the different sectors. If I just give you the example on target C on economic losses and target D, these are critical indicators to inform on financing strategies, and also to inform on possible financing tools that the countries might need, because they give you the understanding of which are, for example, critical infrastructures that have been disrupted by disasters, which are the sectors that are suffering more from the impacts of disasters. Furthermore, we have actually recently launched the Global Risk Assessment Framework, the GRAPH initiative. Through the GRAPH initiative, we are now moving into country pilots. And this initiative looks at, as a the first stage of the initiative is actually looking at improving data at country level and improving also the use of those data. By data, we mean actually hazards data, vulnerability data, exposure data, but also climate data, and possible analytics that the DRR practitioner can be using at the national level. Finally, just let me conclude with the most recent the development of the Africa roadmap for improving the availability, access, and use of disaster risk information, which is mainly targeting early warning and early action. And I have noticed that it is also a very important reiteration that has been said also by the previous speakers. And the objective of this roadmap is actually that of basically designing activities and practical recommendations aiming to improve the availability, accessibility, and use of risk information.
Okay, so I think we'll summarize for the next speaker. Okay, so we will go over to James. He will do a bit of video and then he will respond to the questions. Over to you, James.
Sorry, Joseph, can you clarify whether the video is during this question or during the second question? We still have the second question, Joseph.
We have a bit of the first and then the video and the second.
Okay, so I'll take a few remarks. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. My name is James Kinyangi. I'm the coordinator of the Climate and Development Special Fund at the African Development Bank. And the question here is, what is the bank doing to create an enabling data environment for integrated disaster risk management? The bank is investing in backbone infrastructure to bridge what I call the climate and weather data gap in Africa that's critical for disaster risk management. And these investments are being delivered through the Climate and Development Special Fund, which was born out of the bank's work to increase climate and weather observation networks and support the delivery of climate and weather early warning services for African countries. Now, the fund is established to provide resources to bridge the gap in climate and weather observation. And we know, Joseph has mentioned some of the gaps, but we know from the estimates of WMO that 54% of the continent's surface stations and 71% of its upper air weather stations are unable to capture and report data accurately. The fund is a partnership between the African Union Commission, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank, and it receives financial support from the Intra-ACP program on disaster resilience for Africa, which is funded through the 10th EDF, and also additional contributions from the Nordic Development Fund and also the Swedish International Development Agency. And over the last 10 years, the fund has provided approximately $74 million in technical assistance grants, including the recent GCF approval of $10 million to the Climate Early Warning Project for Liberia under the simplified approval process. Nearly half of this investments, 27 million euro, has been delivered in the last 5 years, providing grant finance directly to 12 countries, 4 institutions, and 5 regional climate centers that serve 27 countries in Africa. The grants strengthen backbone infrastructure, they build data capacities, they address weaknesses in the delivery of climate and weather services, and they reduce loss and damage from extreme weather events. The grants also support disaster risk and contingency planning, very important work that's being done by the Africa Risk Capacity to mitigate climate-induced public expenditure displacement in Africa. Let me just take a few seconds to enumerate some of the achievements of the fund over the last 5 years. One, which is the establishment of a new center for the IGAD region, the Climate Prediction and Application Center, which is now a state-of-the-art, fully solar-powered hub for East Africa's climate information services, serving 10 countries and protecting 200 million people exposed to severe droughts, tropical cyclones, flooding, and locust invasions in the regions. Second, we have invested in a network of high-performance computers in 3 regional centers that are now capable of running detailed models that can accurately predict severe weather events like tropical cyclones and flooding. Third, we have established a new regional center for the Central Africa region. It's now operational, and we are assisting them to develop immediate forecast, short and medium range forecast also with high resolution. Fourth, we have improved the capacity for weather observation in 17 countries. We have procured and installed more than 130 automatic weather stations and 2 automatic message switching systems, which contribute to improved data collection and weather forecasting and climate observation. And last, we have procured and installed 4 regional satellite transmission stations, ensuring that for the first time, Africa has access to Earth observation data from EUMETSAT low polar orbiting satellites. And these data are assimilated and used by countries for numerical weather prediction in order to provide accurate forecast of extreme events. So I would like to stop at this point, Joseph, and if the video can be played, please proceed. Thank you very much.
Hello, Joseph.
Yeah, hello.
Should I play the video now or in his second intervention?
I think we can play it now because he's
Okay.
spent much of the time now.
Okay.
Joseph, are we getting the sound? I don't seem to hear the sound.
Yeah, I don't hear this. The technical people can have a look at it.
Okay, let me play it again because I could hear the sound. Okay.
In Ethiopia, recurring drought has led to widespread food insecurity in rural areas. With millions in need of emergency food assistance, local farmers hope that better access to information and technology will turn the tide on food loss and shortages. Some 40 kilometers outside of Addis Ababa, farmer Zinebek Zudi says what she learned in information sessions on climate inspired her to invest in additional land.
በግብርና በቃ ይሄ ቴክኖሎጂ ከገባ ጀምሮ ማለት ነው በሱ ላይ የሚያውዙ ትምህርት ግብርኖቹ ጥቅሙ ለምን እንደሆነ አስተምረውናል። በጣም እድለኛ ናችሁ እዚህ ባገኛችሁት ነው ብለው በሱ ላይ ብዙ ትምህርት ሰጥተናል። እንደገና ግብርኖቹም ደግሞ እንደዛው አስተምረውናል።
They know their weathers, how the temperature is, the precipitations, the amount, the types of precipitations, enable them to know it. The perception of the community is changing.
Farmer perceptions are changing and fields are producing more thanks to investment from the ClimDev Fund at the African Development Bank and its partnership with UNECA and the African Union Commission and funding from the Nordic Fund, the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency and the European Union. The €1 million investment is expected to reduce the number of Ethiopians impacted by drought and flooding by 4 million through technology and local trainings. Development agents like Guteda Ishetu visit communities periodically, sharing real-time weather information to help farmers navigate challenging seasons.
ወቅታዊ የሆነ ሜትሮሎጂ ኤጀንሲ አገልግሎቶች እንዲያገኙ አድርገን ምክር እንሰጣለን ማለት ነው። በዚህ በሜትሮሎጂ ዙሪያም ደግሞ አርሶ አደሮቻችን ጥሩ ግንዛቤ እንዲኖራቸው አድርገን አርሶ አደሩ አምኖበት የተለያየ መረጃ ከኛ እያገኘ እየሰራበት ነው ማለት ነው። በወቅቱ ሰብሉን እንዲሰበስብና አርሶ አደሩ ሰብሉ እንዳይባክንበት
ClimDev Fund, powering Africa's access to climate information since 2009.
Okay, thanks very much for AFDB for the very clear information, very useful video that details elements of what they are doing to support the climate data. I will move to the next question. I'll move to the next question, which is what best practice can you cite from your organization in mitigating the socioeconomic, fiscal, and financial impacts of disasters in Africa? Over to you, Barry, to address that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Joseph. Much appreciated. So, I think the first kind of comment I'd make in regards to this question, particularly from the World Bank's perspective, we work with governments, is your starting point is always the government's policy priorities. So particularly now in the post-COVID environment where there's very limited, if any, fiscal space to be spending funds on DRO or DRM or risk financing, even though they have very high rates of return. It's very difficult to make these arguments with ministries of finance. So really, you have to have difficult and frank conversations with governments, with ministries of finance in terms of prioritization. Of course, they would like to try and protect everyone and everything in their society, in their country, but given the limited resources, that's not possible. So there really is a trade-off which needs to be made. And these are the kind of hard conversations that we often have with ministers of finance. So really kind of clarifying, who do you want to protect? Is it farmers, as we saw in that great video from African Development Bank? Is it the poorest, the most vulnerable? Is it businesses, jobs? What do you want to protect them against? So, droughts are obviously a huge problem in the Africa region. Flooding, pandemic now is becoming an increasing important risk. And, given when you know who you want to protect and against what perils, then you can start thinking about, okay, what financing instruments can I use to help me achieve my policy objectives, me as the government? I think that's the first point, really focusing on the policy priorities. So second point is, I suppose, recognizing, risk financing, risk management, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It obviously operates in the broader remit of government policy priorities, government intervention. And a very good example, which I've seen many times, is the area of agriculture insurance, which I've worked on quite a lot in the Africa region. But being frank, ministers of finance that I've spoken to, they don't particularly want ag insurance. What they want is to grow their ag GDP as a way to grow their GDP and to grow their tax base. So what their objective is to grow ag GDP. But that's very difficult in a context like Africa, where a lot of agriculture is rain-fed, and there's a lot of risks involved, and credit is very constrained in the agricultural sector. So, agricultural insurance is really a means to an end. If we can provide farmers with ag insurance, we can also help them gain access to credit. They can use that to invest in their farms, grow their output, and therefore achieve the policy objectives of the government, which is to grow their ag GDP. And my third point, I may get a fourth in, I'm watching the clock, I'm 2 minutes now. My third point is, it's important to start. So I think, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In some countries, they start with launching, one, maybe two risk finance programs, for example, an agriculture insurance program, a shock responsive safety nets. Other countries, they start more at the policy level. They develop a national disaster risk finance strategy, top down, specify their priorities, and then start developing the programs. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that, particularly governments, they start. Start doing something, start, launching pilots, learn as you go. I think this is a very exciting and innovative space in the Africa region. And, as you gain more years experience, you increase capacity within the government, within the private sector, within civil society for, risk financing, and you constantly improve. So this kind of feedback improvement loop is really important, particularly in such an innovative space, which is risk financing. And then my fourth point in 3 minutes, so I'll stop very quickly, but it's cross-sectoral. So I think one of the most enjoyable parts of my job is I get to work with experts from all different fields: social protection, transport, governance, and disaster risk management. I'm a finance expert, I'm an actuary by training. So I think this cross-sectoral nature, which that really requires convening power on the government side. You need the ability to convene across ministries. And again, this place kind of Ministry of Finance in a central role, because they have the ability to do that through the budget, because they have that role as a financier of the country. So I'll stop there. I know that we're challenged for time, but thanks for giving me the opportunity. Joseph, back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Barry, for the excellent intervention, clearly articulating the financial, socioeconomic approaches that is being undertaken by GFDR. We'll hand over to Eric to also provide perspective on this question. Eric, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joseph. Yes, I think the question is about best practice here. Maybe instead of best practice, I would be more talking about experience feedback from the work. And I think what's interesting from the European Commission is based on the discussion we had with implementing partners and stakeholders. I think it's quite obvious to us that there's more and more of a growing interest in the area of disaster risk finance. And in this discussion, I think there are three elements that are very much being highlighted. Is that First, the use of disaster risk finance instruments in the humanitarian aid field is very relevant. Second, the use of premium subsidies and capitalization of risk pooling mechanism is also something that we want to push forward. And third, I would say the need for an improved disaster risk finance architecture at global and regional levels are needed. And I think the European Union is support the idea to really explore more of this on this area of disaster risk finance architecture. The financial protection in vulnerable countries has increased in the last few years, and much more needs to be done to reach a solid architecture that allows for more integrated approach of fiscal, climate, and adaptation policies, so as to enable countries to allocate prearranged finances that can be quickly dispersed in case of hazards. Maybe also I would like to take the opportunity to make a reference to the European Green Deal that has been launched earlier this year. In the coming 7 years, the European Commission will engage intensively with partners countries and organizations to support green transition that will help with the implementation of the Paris Agreement and promote disaster risk reduction strategy via integrated approach. So that's really something that we want to showcase. And I think referring back to what Barry was mentioning earlier, is that there is very much this cross-sectoral element to it, or the integrated approach that needs to be focused on. And together with the European Investment Bank and the EU member states, I think we want to be at the forefront, contributing to climate finance. And I think the President von der Leyen, in her State of European Union speech earlier in September, committed to 4 additional billion euros for climate finance. So that's something that we really want to make the best use of. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the very compact intervention on what the European Union is doing to address the socioeconomic impacts and supporting countries to be able to respond to disasters. And so we'll hand over to Francois Kayitakri to provide a perspective from Risk ACP. Over to you, Francois.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. From the African risk capacity perspective, I think the best practice that we can actually share with others is that we have been already focusing on the impact on lives and livelihoods of people. Is the whole systems has put in place so that you can really have direct impact on people. This insurance mechanism is linked to contingency planning. So you have a clear plan of intervention when there is a payout. I think this is something that is important to keep in mind. And the second thing is to give to government predictable source of funding. So it's once the policy is signed, at least the country has a clear picture of what they can expect if there is a disaster. I think this predictability is very important for budget planning and also for resource allocation for the government. The third thing is about the institutional capacity. We develop also the capacity of countries to be able themselves to assess the risk profile, and so that when they transfer the risk to the market, they know exactly what they have. And the other spillover impact is actually the building the capacity for error warning and disaster risk management in general in the country. The last thing is that the whole principle of our African risk capacity is for risk pooling across the continent, because disasters are not happening at the same time across the continent. It's happening sometimes in a regionalized way. So which means that if we can build this continental solidarity, I think that we have made a great path forward, a great step forward. I think this is important to keep in mind. That's one thing that we want to really to support in the future, to have this continental solidarity through risk pooling. Over to you, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. I think this is very clear. We will need to scale up across the continent. Let me hand over to James for his final
Can you hear me, Joseph?
Comment on it. Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me, Joseph?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, just 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, I will say three things, Joseph. What is the bank doing in terms of supporting best practices for mitigating the impacts of disasters? One, we are running a facility that we call the Special Relief Fund, which is a facility that supports the financing of emergencies. Each member country of the bank in an emergency can apply for support of up to $1 million, and they can get a second support of another $1 million to make a total of $2 million when the impacts from the disasters are substantial. For example, when Mozambique went through the grueling events of Hurricanes Idai and Kenneth, they were able to access that support. And in addition to that, they received a structuring of the programs for Mozambique in the order of about $100 million. So on top of the $2 million that they received for direct support for the emergencies, they will also over time receive another $100 million in restructured programs. So this is one instrument and tool that the bank uses. Secondly,
okay, thanks very much. I think we have just 2 minutes. So I would like to summarize in terms of what.
Sorry to interrupt you, Joseph. We forgot UNDRR. They haven't made their intervention, so we will. I think go beyond the allocated time. But UNDRR can have the floor. Yes.
Okay, apologies for that, Roberto. I think you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope we don't forget UNDRR in the future.
We can never forget you, Roberto.
Very quickly, I think this question that is about mitigation, it's very important for DRR, I mean, disaster risk reduction. So far, we've been talking a lot about response. Even, when we're talking about financing strategies, most of the countries in Africa, I can cite 2 examples, the one for Kenya, for example, and Malawi, they are mainly looking at response. So how to ensure that they have resources for response. But what is important is also to mitigate disasters, right? And what we've been doing, for example, is to develop disaster risk profiles, which are very useful to inform countries on what the possible and potential impacts of those disasters are, and what are the possible investments that they could make, and how those investments in disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation could reduce those impacts. We're talking about new resources becoming available. We're talking about the Green Climate Fund. We're talking about also the European Union that is investing more in adaptation. But what is needed, for example, in Africa is to understand which would be the possible investments that are efficient, that are economically efficient, and how to finance them. I mean, just overlaying, for example, a possible intervention over those risk profiles, we did in Africa a few simulations of, for example, investing in multi-purpose dams for flood retention, and for example, also investing in drought-resistant crops. These also to link up with the needs of African government to think, for example, of GDP growth. This can give the evidence based and can inform investors on how to what to finance in Africa, and what would be more efficient and more and could even make their GDP growth if we're looking at the potential benefits that are indirect. For example, when we invest in a multi-purpose dam, it can also generate electricity. There are multiple benefits that arise from those investments. So just to conclude there, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for that wonderful intervention. So by way of summary, I think we had a very clear message from Maha, who spoke a lot about the need for looking at strategic data customized to specific needs. The insurance companies will focus on data, impact-based data. Ministry of Finance has a different interest looking at contingent line of credit and instruments. Eric also spoke about the fact that data is critical for decision making, and part of what EU is doing is building capacity through the Copernicus data platform and GMS in Africa to support the work that is being done in Africa. They also spoke about the lessons and experience from the field, which is critical for disaster risk financing, things of risk pooling, and the need to use new approaches. Francois also talked about the ARC as a specialized agency, and also spoke about innovation to transfer risks to the international market, need to adopt disaster risk reduction through adaptation, which means integrating disaster risk reduction into adaptation planning is critical. Contingency planning, risks pooling, and regionalized ways of looking at disaster insurance is critical. Roberto also spoke about the fact that the global context, $1.9 billion on DR is not sufficient, because if you unpack, look at the country level, is actually less than 1% of the commitment at the country level. And this needs to be country owned. So country level data in terms of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability is critical. James spoke about the work that is being done by the ClimDev initiative, the investment in terms of climate information, early warning systems, critical for strengthening countries. So in a nutshell, I see 4 clear pathways coming out of this. Transformational planning programming is critical. With climate science and must inform strategic plans and country programming, and also catalyzing climate innovation in terms of using analytics and other innovations to underpin and create strategic partnerships. And mobilizing investment at scale is critical. We need to really go beyond what we are doing at the moment if we will be able to address the challenge. The $100 billion a year will not be sufficient, looking at the scale of disasters that we're experiencing. And of course, expansion and replication of knowledge is very, very important. Knowledge brokering on climate investments, science and technology, institutional collaboration, as well as impact evaluation will be critical for us to really transform the way Africa manages climate and related risks. And so I would like to thank you for your patience and the great presentation and discussion that we've had. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Sandra for the final comments. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I believe this was really an excellent side event. However, time did not allow us to have that interactive part with the question and answer segment. However, I've put the email address of the African Union, the Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems room. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, you can send them to us and then we'll forward them to the panelists. Thank you so much, and we'll make the recording available to you for all those who've taken part in this side event, because we have your email address. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.